Good morning, A-Pushers. Welcome. I'm not here today. Miss Van Sant or Miss Root is here with you. So we're going to jump right into it. You should have already watched the little 6-minute video giving you some information about the Great Awakening. So I'm just going to pull out some of the points that I think are important to note. Realize that the Great Awakening was, and you should be taking notes right now. Sorry, should have mentioned that. So what was the Great Awakening? It was a religious revival movement. And this is the first step towards what we call evangelicalism. And this is when, preachers take on a lot of passion and they really get out there. There's tent preaching. They travel around and they really try to reach new people and convert new people to their religions. So evangelicalism is new birth, and it's considered the ultimate religious experience. And oftentimes you'll see people openly weep in the audience, start trembling. It's a very emotional experience for them. And we see a couple of preachers, John Edwards and especially George Whitefield, who you see on this image, preaching. And Whitefield will preach to crowds of thousands by the time he's done touring the colonies. But followers accepted that they were sinners and they asked for salvation. This is very different than what we know of our previous religions, right, that we've talked about. Before the 1730s, most colonies had these established religions. Congregationalism was, of course, the largest in New England. This is the Puritan church. And we know that they had beliefs like predestination and which wasn't very exciting, that everything was already predestined for you, and that your actions in this world had very little effect on whether you were going to heaven or hell. The Great Awakening changes those ideas, but it's also important to realize that Anglicanism, the Church of England, was still very popular here in the colonies. Not everyone came for the idea of freedom of religion. New York, the southern colonies, they all still were part of the Church of England and practiced Anglicanism. So when we talk with this Great Awakening, you'll hear the term old lights versus new lights. Old lights are the old Anglican and Congregationalist churches, and the preachers that haven't accepted this new way, this more dramatic way of preaching. These old lights are still just writing hours-long sermons, standing up very dryly in front of their audiences and just reading what's there. Whereas the new lights are really going out and trying to have this conversion experience with their congregation. So churches that grew as a result of the Great Awakening, we have the Presbyterianism Church, the Methodism, Baptism. So, and these are all new light religions or denominations that are still around today. And so when we talk about the Great Awakening, know that it challenged authority. The hierarchy of the established churches were under threat. And this is one of the reasons why Congregationalists and Anglicans did not like them. And so the Great Awakening said that anybody could be converted and born again. You didn't need traditional church leadership to decide whether or not you belonged, right? Remember, we talked about the Congregationalists. You had to be a visible saint in order to be a church member, right? That you had to live your life so godly. That idea changes with the new lights. And so two new light preachers that are highly important during this time. We'll start with Jonathan Edwards because he really is the first of the Great Awakening preachers. He starts out as a Yale minister, refuses to convert to the Church of England. And he is the start of these new generation of preachers. He strongly believed still in that idea of predestination, though. So some of them thought differently. He's most famous for his sinners in the hands of an angry God speech. And so one of his famous quotes, and when he was up there speaking, he would just yell and roar and really tell people that they were damned to go to hell. And it was really very dramatic speaking. So one of his famous quotes is, "God was an angry judge and humans are sinners." And he would say this with fury and conviction, much more than what I could. He would actually scream at his audiences. The second Great Awakening preacher that you do need to know is George Whitefield. He started his career in Britain and came over to the colonies to tour the colonies. He was an actor in Britain, and he brought a lot of those skills with him. And like I said, people would flock to hear George Whitefield as he toured the colonies, and he would weep and tremble as they watched him, and they just loved him. And crowds of thousands would be standing around, and supposedly everyone in that crowd could hear him, even the furthest in the back. That's how loud he was. And so this was very important to understand that he was very well respected. And we're going to look at a reading from George Whitefield today and decide, why was he so popular? What made him so popular? Other than just having a booming, loud voice and bringing his acting skills to his revivals that he would do. So let's take a moment and look at a document that we're going to do today. You've done some of these documents before, but I wanted to take a moment today to really look at this first document. So when we look at a document, the first thing we have to do is really source the information. So remember, I told you that the Great Awakening occurred 1720s, 1730s, maybe into the 40s at the most, right? So when we look at this document, the first thing we see, it's document A, it's a Great Awakening document. And then you should scroll down and look at the source line. So this source is the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, 1793. And we know that, and it says here, Ben Franklin was a good friend of George Whitefield, though he did not agree with his religious beliefs. So look at that date, 1793. Now, I just told you that, this document was from the or that this occurred in the 1730s, let's say. So that's really a long time away, isn't it? We're talking 50 years after this time. And so this raises some questions about the validity of this source, right? Because we know memory isn't the best way to, is not always the most reliable. So when we look at this, I can see, it was written in 1793, over 50 years after the Great Awakening. So I question its reliability. Maybe Franklin's memory of hearing what Whitefield really differs from what actually happened. It's hard to predict what Franklin will say about Whitefield. On one hand, they're friends and probably won't say bad things. But on the other hand, I know Franklin really is a great Enlightenment thinker, and we're going to do an activity with that this next unit. So I don't think he would have brought the whole revival aspect of the Great Awakening. So I really don't know what to predict at this point, but it's raising some questions for me, the date and who's writing it, right? That Ben Franklin was an Enlightenment thinker, but he was a friend of George Whitefield. So let's explore this document and see where it leads us. So that is sourcing your document, right? Now let's walk through. We're going to read through this document briefly together. You have this on yellow paper. You should have a document that looks like this. Make sure you pull that out and follow along with me while I read. So Mr. Whitefield went preaching all the way through the colonies to Georgia, where there are many helpless children unprovided for. The sight of this miserable situation inspired the benevolent heart of Mr. Whitefield with the idea of building an orphan house there, in which they might be supported and educated. Returning northward, he preached up this charity and made large collections. I happened to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I realized he intended to finish with a collection, and I silently decided that he should get nothing from me. Franklin thought the orphan house should be built in Philadelphia. I had a hand in my pocket, a handful of copper money, 3 or 4 silver dollars, and 5 pieces in gold. As he proceeded, I began to soften and concluded to give up the coppers. Another stroke of his oratory made me ashamed that I decided to give the silver. He finished so admirably that I just emptied my pocket wholly into the collector's dish, gold and all. He had a loud, clear voice and articulated his words and sentences perfectly, that he might be heard and understood at a great distance, especially with his audiences, however numerous, were completely silent. He preached one evening, and I computed that he may well have been heard by more than 30,000. All right, so let's talk about this. We're talking about contextualization. And as we look at this, first, Franklin says that Whitefield preached throughout the colonies and he was raising money for orphans in Georgia. This makes me wonder why there were so many orphans in Georgia, right? I remember hearing that Georgia was settled by debtors and poor people, and so many died young, maybe. Did they leave a lot of orphans? Second, I see that Whitefield is a very effective speaker. He convinced Franklin to empty his pockets, right? And he didn't even agree with Whitefield's religious views. So finally, I see Whitefield was super popular. He had a really loud voice, and that his audience was completely quiet. That's almost impossible for me to imagine. One man's voice to be heard by 30,000 people. It's amazing to think about that. This is before the age of microphones or sound systems, etc. So based on this document, I would say that George Whitefield was popular for a few reasons. One, he was a really convincing speaker. He raised money for important charities, and he had a really loud voice. So you guys are going to go ahead and fill in your graphic organizer. You should have a handout that looks like this. And you'll see we just kind of walked through all the information for document A. So make sure you fill that out. And then you're going to go on and read documents B and C by yourself. And when you're done, there's some wrap-up questions here on the back. This is due by the end of class. Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Thanks for participating.